All right, the first topic we're going to cover is bias and what bias is and how to establish fact versus opinion in a piece of nonfiction. So the official definition of bias is favoring one side over the other and giving information that only shows favor for that one side rather than being objective and two-sided and showing the pros and cons of both sides. So there is a difference between bias, which is showing that one side, and sometimes, we all have bias on certain topics, and we don't always intentionally try to show our bias, but it does happen. So that's why we need to be very aware of it, so that way we can avoid it as much as possible. But the difference between that and something called propaganda is when that bias is used systematically and intentionally to try to persuade the audience or maybe scare them or get them to believe something as an emotional response. An easy way to spot bias is by looking at the choice of words that the author is using throughout the article or the writing or whatever it may be, because that can show their choice of, especially adjectives and description words, can really show how they feel about that certain topic. For example, it would be very neutral to simply say that Frank has little money. Right? That's just kind of a fact. We can tell that the amount of money he has is very small. It would be bias in favor of Frank if we were to say that Frank is thrifty, because if he's thrifty, that means he's good at handling that small amount of money and still getting what he needs, but spending within his means. It would be unfavorable bias for Frank if we said that Frank is a cheapskate, because that's saying that he's using that little bit of money that he has, but he's trying to buy things cheaply or rip people off or hoarding money, and even if it's just a little bit, for their own benefit. There are many ways that authors can show bias in favor or out of favor for a subject. And it's not always, like I said, it's not always intentional. Sometimes it does just creep in. There's a lot of factors we have to consider that are influencing the writer and the facts that are involved in that writing. If the author is including an interviewer, the thoughts and opinions and background of that interviewer could show bias one way or the other. If they're only interviewing certain people, right, they might be showing bias in one way or the other. Looking at their own personal thoughts and opinions and background, if they're not doing a well-rounded research, their opinions might be in favor or out of favor for one certain side. So you really just have to consider how they're presenting information, and a lot of the times what they're leaving out. So if they're purposefully omitting information, or maybe just because they're not aware of a certain fact or a certain subject that's taking place, or side that's taking place, that could show bias. You could also show bias through the pictures that they're including and what kind of people or places or images are in those pictures. You could even consider the name and the title of the article and how that shows bias. Or think about their word choice and tone and the statistics that they're using. Are the statistics in favor or out of favor for a certain subject? Are they being very harsh and critical or very extra peppy and extra encouraging? All of those word choices, tone, statistics, everything can show bias one way or the other. So while bias can creep in unintentionally, and it's not always necessarily a bad thing. We're all human beings and we all have our own thoughts and opinions. So naturally when we write, we are going to typically favor one side or the other. We just have to be very careful and very aware of the fact that bias does exist and make sure we can point it out, so that way whenever, especially if we're doing research or informative writing or informative analysis, we can try to figure out with our knowledge of bias what the actual common ground is and what the real facts are without the opinion in place. Which brings me to our second subtopic of the day, fact versus opinion. So, official definition. Fact is a statement that is true and based on truth. Some facts stay the same forever. Some facts simply change when data or other statistics or other information is presented. For example, you can state a fact that food is hot, but that doesn't mean that the food is going to always be hot. Eventually it cools down because the temperature lowers. But at that moment, whenever that statement was made, the food is hot. That is fact. You can't really dispute that. An opinion is a statement that shows what someone thinks, and it's not always true. It's just based on our own ideas and our own thoughts and the information that we've chosen to gather for ourselves. And like facts, opinions can change as well as people learn and grow and find new information. The best way to tell a fact from an opinion is that facts can be proven, whereas opinions are harder to prove. People might think they can prove them based on the limited information they're providing, but in reality, you can't really prove an opinion because it's your own personal idea. Opinions are based out of arguments, whereas facts are based off of actual proven information. And yes, it is true that you can support an opinion with factual information, but that doesn't necessarily make it true for everyone. It still might only be true for you, and it still might be arguable. So it's still an opinion. All right, so I'm going to have you go and practice some bias-seeking things and have you practice identifying fact versus opinion. And then later on, we're going to apply that with text structure and author's purpose and ethos, pathos, and logos and all of the stuff we've been learning up to this point. So, as always, let me know if you have any questions. I am happy to answer what I can, and I hope you found this video informative. See ya. I'm trying, but I can't think of what to say.
Talk about flowers.
I should talk about flowers. Okay, I should talk about flowers.